This is a recording of papers given at the conference on the 7th of November 1981, organised by the Scottish Georgian Society and the Department of Extra-Mural Studies of the University of Edinburgh, with the support of the Scottish Church's Architectural Heritage Trust. Mr. James Simpson, architect.
Ladies and gentlemen, what crisis? Actually, I don't think we have a crisis, and perhaps we should be just a little careful that we don't work ourselves up into an excessive feeling of crisis. We have problems, certainly, but let's keep them in perspective, and let's not fail to appreciate what has been achieved in the last 5 years. But first, what's the nature of the problem? It is that, as a consequence of the place held by the Church in society since its reorganization or organization in the early Middle Ages, we have an inheritance of buildings which are scattered throughout the country, many of which are old, historically important, and emotionally and socially important in the communities which have built and used them, and of which many, though not necessarily the same ones, are architecturally important or are key buildings in planning or townscape terms in the villages, boroughs, or cities for which they were designed. A substantial number of these buildings are surplus to requirements, and there are various reasons for this. Fewer people go to church regularly or at all. Fewer still walk to church, so a building can serve a wider area. The disruption of 1843 and all that went before and followed, and the reunion of 1929, has landed the Church of Scotland with 3 churches and many parishes, the former Old, Free and United Presbyterian Kirks, while the continuing Free Presbyterian and United Free churches also have buildings in a lot of places, particularly in the Highlands. The Scottish Episcopal Church has more than its share of good 19th century churches. The Roman Catholic Church is, of course, very strong, particularly in the West, but perhaps has rather less than its share of architecturally distinguished buildings. The Congregationalists, Methodists, and others are quite well represented. We are, in a word, grossly over-churched, particularly on account of the disruption and reunion as far as the Church of Scotland is concerned. The Kirk intends to reduce the number of its ministers by about a third, from about 1,700 at the moment to about 1,200 over the next 20 years. And this is bound to have implications both for congregations and for buildings. The Episcopalians are also, though for slightly different reasons, giving up buildings. We have a problem, therefore, but I don't really think it's a crisis. The county of Norfolk, for example, has something like 650 parish churches, more than 3 times the number that we have in Lothian, including Edinburgh and West Lothian presbyteries. The majority of those Norfolk churches are medieval. Many are great wall churches with huge towers, bells, hammer beam roofs, wall paintings, and glass of the highest quality. Comparisons are odious, I know, but in all honesty, our treasures are more modest, though nonetheless precious for that. But if they can cope, and I believe they can, surely we can too. So let us keep our problems in perspective and remember that they are manageable. Let us remember too that in the last 5 years we've seen the establishment of state aid, the Historic Buildings Council's churches scheme, the successful launching of SCAHT, SCAHT, the Scottish Church's Architectural Heritage Trust, And most important of all, in my view, the acceptance by the Church of Scotland and by the Episcopal Church, both of them more than a quarter of a century behind the Church of England in this, of the need for systematic maintenance of church buildings based on thorough architects' quinquennial inspections. I may be simplifying and anticipating slightly in saying this, but I really believe that this message has got or is about to get through. And of course, the very fact that we're all here under, I suppose, a conservationist banner is itself evidence that the problem is recognized. And diagnosis, after all, is fundamental to the prescription of effective treatment. We must remember, however, that we're here, many of us, as conservationists, and that our interests are not the same as those of the churches who own and are responsible for the buildings for whose survival we are concerned. If we're to avoid antagonizing the churches, whose cooperation, goodwill, and enthusiasm we desperately need, we must remember that they are not primarily in the business of preserving monuments. The final paragraph of the Norwich Diocese pamphlet on redundant churches states that conservationists are justified in stepping in should an unwanted building seem to merit preservation, provided that the living church does not suffer as a result. And as a bare statement, that seems reasonable enough to me. We, as conservationists, must accept that there is an over-churching problem. And we must welcome the fact that since the General Assembly of, I think, 2 years ago, the architectural merit is a factor which Church of Scotland presbyteries must take into account in deciding on unions and readjustments and consequential decisions on redundancy and the disposal of church buildings. But will it be too much, I wonder, to ask the Church of Scotland and the other churches to go a little further than this and to carry out or to cooperate in the carrying out of a study with a view to finding out which church buildings are on architectural grounds dispensable, which must survive at all costs, which might easily be put to other uses and which might not, and on grounds of sensible ecclesiastical organization, which buildings are likely to be at risk. Is this something which this society, the Scottish Development Department, the Heriot Watt University Conservation Unit, could perhaps help? Of course, I know that these matters are democratically decided within the Church of Scotland, and that no one at 121 George Street can tell presbyteries or congregations what to do. These matters are frequently difficult, and churchmen often resent the sort of pressures that people like us try to bring to bear. Nevertheless, I cannot but believe that a study of this sort would be useful, and that it would be welcomed by many in the churches themselves. Of course, we all wish as many church buildings as possible to remain in use for worship. There are ways in which this can be made easier, and I shall return to the subject of efficient and economical fabric maintenance. But I think we should briefly consider the range of options for redundant churches without going into too much detail. Churches come in all shapes, sizes and situations: large, small, Gothic, classical, medieval, modern, town, country, and so on. For some, demolition may be no great loss, and for others, an alternative future use may be easy to envisage. There can be embarrassment when the living church wishes to realize the site value of an architecturally important building. And there have been worrying cases where congregations have exploited the ecclesiastical exemption from some planning and listed building legislation by stripping furniture and fittings, not as a part of a liturgical reordering, but to devalue the building architecturally in order to make it easier to dispose of. That is quite simply immoral. And if it became common practice, the ecclesiastical exemption could not long survive. Restrictions placed by churches on the sort of uses to which their former buildings may be put are, on the other hand, understandable, though it's less easy for conservationists to sympathize when such restrictions are based on sectarian rather than on moral scruples. Demolition and change of use, therefore, are two of the options for redundant churches. Between the two are a couple of intermediate options. In urban situations, it can be the case that a mediocre church may possess a tower or steeple which is better, or which is a landmark in the townscape. Or if we extend the jargon, as Colin McWilliam has done with admirable logic in his book on Scottish townscape, it's a town mark. It may be a reasonable compromise in such circumstances for a church site to be redeveloped with the incorporation of the town mark, tower or steeple. In the case of some country churches, on the other hand, which may be picturesquely set in a kirkyard, alternative uses may be more difficult to find, and total demolition may be simply unnecessary. Ruination must be an option to be considered. A ruined kirk in an old kirkyard is not, after all, a total loss architecturally, though I would just warn that ruined kirks can become dangerous structures in terms of the Building Acts, and as such can attract the attention of conscientious or over-conscientious building control officers. We do, of course, have some churches, great and small, ruined and roofed, but nearly all medieval, which have in the past been considered to be so important that they are maintained as guardianship monuments in the care of the Secretary of State. In nearly all cases, this is an ideal arrangement, and the buildings are beautifully, if not always conservatively, maintained. I would like, though, to raise a question mark over the slightly curious status of the two marvellous medieval cathedral churches of Glasgow and Dunblane. The Church of Scotland congregations who use these buildings have no responsibility for their maintenance, for their guardianship monuments. At Dunblane, the arrangement seems to work well and happily. But if I tell you that when I was at Glasgow Cathedral earlier this year, the level of heating was so high that the crystallization of soluble salts was notably damaging the stonework in the late kirk, and that there was a dead Christmas tree at the east end of the nave at the end of March, you will appreciate that something was not quite right. The lesson, in my view, is that while state responsibility for dead churches is fine, guardianship status for living churches is not entirely satisfactory. So far, I have sought to persuade you that we do not have a crisis, but that we do have, for straightforward historical reasons, a problem of over-churching, which must be faced, and which with goodwill and cooperation is manageable. I've suggested that the problem should be subjected to analysis, and that the churches, the FDD, academic and conservationist bodies should get together on this. And I've looked at the range of options which exist for churches which are surplus to ecclesiastical requirements, a range which includes demolition, partial demolition, ruination, change of use, and guardianship status. There is, however, a further important weapon which plays an important role in England, of which we've not so far availed ourselves on this side of the border: a redundant churches fund. In this context, it may be useful to rehearse the Church of England's procedures and some statistics for you. When a church in England is closed for regular worship, it goes into a waiting period of not less than a year and not more than 3 years. During this period, the Diocesan Board of Finance assumes ownership of the building and is responsible for its care, maintenance, and insurance. Meanwhile, the Diocesan Redundant Churches Uses Committee explores the possibility of finding a suitable use for the building, while the Advisory Board for Redundant Churches gives advice on its historic and architectural qualities to the church commissioners. If the search for a suitable use is unsuccessful, the church will either be recommended for vesting in the Redundant Churches Fund, or will be subject to a scheme for demolition issued by the church commissioners. If vested in the fund, the church will be preserved for all time to come in the interests of the nation and of the Church of England. For the 5 years from 1979 to 84, the English Redundant Churches Fund has resources of 2.9 million for the care and maintenance of the fabric, contents, monuments, decorations, furnishings and fittings of churches vested in it. And this sum is contributed as follows: 967,000 voted by the General Synod, 483,000 from the sale of sites of demolished churches, and 1,450,000 from the state through the Department of the Environment. During the 9 years up to 1978, 562 churches became redundant in England and were disposed of as follows: 253 found an alternative use, that's 45%. 121, that's 22%, were preserved by being vested in the redundant churches of the fund. That is 1/5 of all churches made redundant. 5, just 1%, were preserved by becoming guardianship monuments. And 183, 32%, just under a third of the total, were demolished. At the 17th of December 1980, 161 churches were vested in the Redundant Churches Fund. It really is high time, if I may say so, that there was a Scottish Redundant Churches Fund, possibly Church of Scotland, but ideally interdenominational. Is it too much to ask that a proportion of the proceeds from the sale of the sites of demolished churches should be directed towards such a fund, to ask for some additional contribution from the churches, and to ask for these funds to be matched by the state? If we divided the English figures by 10, we would be looking for, say, 60,000 a year for 5 years. And if that enabled the fund to have acquired and to hold a dozen or so outstanding redundant churches by the end of the first quinquennium, some of our most pressing problems would be solved. But there are churches which are manifestly redundant, for which there is no obvious alternative use, and for which guardianship is neither a practical nor an ideal option. I believe that the National Heritage Memorial Fund might be willing to contribute to a Scottish Redundant Churches Fund. And I would suggest that the Scottish Churches Architectural Heritage Trust which has achieved so much in applying small resources to good effect, might be a suitable body on which to base such a fund. A further option for redundant churches, then, their vesting in a Scottish Redundant Churches Fund. While I'm in the business of setting up new bodies, incidentally, may I also throw out the suggestion that there's a need for yet another one, which might also be closely linked to the Scottish Churches Trust. The Friends of Scottish Churches, with a membership. There is, I believe, a very substantial potential membership for such a body outside existing church congregations, and significant untapped reserves of interest, voluntary labour and cash. In Norfolk alone, the Friends of Norwich Cathedral raise and spend at least five-figure sums on the cathedral every year, and a lot of good work is done by the Friends of the Norwich churches and by the Friends of the Norfolk churches. Surely there is a place for such an organisation, or for such organisations, the Friends of Highland churches, the Friends of Lothian churches. Surely there is a place for them here. However, with that aside, I want to devote the rest of this paper to churches in ecclesiastical use. For it's in everyone's interest, surely, that as many church buildings as possible remain open for worship. There are two main reasons for closing churches: inefficient use of manpower and the cost of fabric maintenance. It's not really for me to deal with the first of these. Suffice to say that different things are being tried in different places, and that we're bound to see a change in the pattern of ministry in the future. As far as the Church of Scotland is concerned, country ministers now take on a clutch of parishes, while in the boroughs there's a return to the medieval Scottish pattern of the single borough kirk. There must obviously be changes in the cities too, but these changes do not necessarily lead to the abandonment of buildings. In the country, it's quite normal for churches to be used on alternate Sundays or at different times. And in the boroughs, one church may be retained for worship while another provides hall accommodation. In some places, a team of 2 or 3 ministers may serve a larger number of buildings, and in others, a country parish may be linked to a borough parish. All in all, though, reductions or redistribution of manpower need not, of necessity, lead to the closure and abandonment of buildings. In fact, it's well known that every time a church is closed for worship, a significant proportion of the congregation does not transfer or join another congregation, but leaves the church altogether. To that extent, therefore, closures are bad for the church. The cost of fabric maintenance is another matter altogether. And on this subject, I'm addressing the churches generally, individual congregations, ministers, priests, boards, sessions, vestries, fabric committees, and conveners, the architectural profession, the Historic Buildings Council, the Scottish Churches Architectural Heritage Trust, and other interested bodies and individuals. For some reason, which I have never understood, Scotland has a reputation in some quarters for being good at maintaining its churches. I suspect that before the war, when traditional church-going was still the rule, this reputation was perhaps justified. But harder times have found us wanting, and it is certainly not true today. This is a consequence of inadequate procedures and a lack of professionalism. For too long, churches have been maintained in an ad hoc fashion. Out of sight has been out of mind, so that internal decoration has had priority over unseen gutter leaks, and tradesmen and professional members of congregations have had their brains and pockets unfairly picked. As a consequence, ecclesiastical work has not really been taken seriously by my profession, for example. Basic maintenance has been neglected, and necessary repairs have been botched. Church after church is found to have such a maintenance backlog and consequential damage so severe that its very survival is cast into doubt. In the same post-war period, things in England have happened rather differently. Since 1955, when architects' quinquennial inspections became compulsory, the vast majority of churches have been inspected 4 or 5 times. Their general condition is known and understood, and in most cases it is better than it was. At the same time, the ecclesiastical branch, if it can be called that, of the architectural profession has been strengthened, and good professional advice is probably more widely and readily available than it was. Here, the condition of most churches is not well understood, and it's probably generally worse than it was. Congregations are continually being surprised, and the architectural profession is probably less well equipped than it was 25 years ago. But all the signs are that the tide is turning at last, and perhaps in another 25 years things will be better. It's really up to us to see that they are. I'm very deliberately thinking and talking in terms of a long, slow timescale, because churches of all buildings operate on a long timescale. Our present maintenance problems have not arisen overnight. They've been creeping up on us since the war. They will not overwhelm us this year or next, and it will take us until the end of the century at least to get them under control. So let us please bear this question of timescale continually in mind. Let us also bear in mind that if the costs of fabric maintenance and major repairs seem to us at the moment to be heavy, that is because things are out of control. I have a favourite metaphor called the plateau of good repair. Keep a building on the plateau with daily care, a stitch in time, and all that elementary good advice of William Morris, and maintenance will cost little. Let the building fall off the edge of the plateau, and it descends rapidly. It costs more to arrest the fall and to hold it in a position on the slope, let alone to pull it back up, than it does to keep it on the plateau. Our aim, I suggest, should be to have all our churches in ecclesiastical use back onto the plateau by the end of the century. It's a major task, but I believe it's achievable. So let us stop the panic and the talk of crises. Let us stop lashing out at the problem with uncontrolled spending on a few buildings while we neglect the remainder. Let us settle down to the task calmly and systematically. Let us cooperate, and let us get our procedures and our professional and technical standards right. How do we start? I've already suggested the need for a proper analysis of the overchurching problem, a balancing of requirements and resources, taking architectural and townscape considerations, among others, into account. That's the first thing. The second is almost underway already, in that discussions are in progress between the Church of Scotland and the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland about a scheme of architects' quinquennial inspections. The principal difficulty about this, frankly, is that ecclesiastical patronage of this sort has been absent for so long that the architectural profession is ill-equipped to cope with it. Education for the task will take time, and in the meantime, careful control will be necessary to ensure that appropriate and comparable standards are set and maintained. From the time that the scheme is approved, it may still take 5 or 10 years to get first inspections done on all churches. So I would say to the churches and to the RIS, don't rush it, get it right. It will pay off in the end. I and the RIS Subcommittee on Church Inspections, chaired by Desmond Hodges, of which I was a member, have been accused of an excessively purist approach on this matter. I make no apology for that, for I believe profoundly that we've got to get it right. But architects' quinquennial inspections are not an end in themselves. They're a means of regularly monitoring the health of a building, a means of ensuring that fabric expenditure is based on proper long-term thinking and an understood system of priorities. Such an inspection might take a day, and all reasonably accessible parts of the building, including towers, roofs and gutters using ladders, should be examined. The report, which might take the architect another day to write, should be in 3 parts. The first part should explain the purpose and limitations of the report and should contain a brief architectural account of the building. The second part should contain a systematic description of all parts of the building, noting materials, construction, particular defects and general condition. The third part should contain specific recommendations for repairs, and these should always be divided into urgent, necessary and desirable categories, and may also include a section giving guidance on normal maintenance, gutter cleaning, and so on. Lists of useful publications, such as those put out by the Council for the Care of Churches and the Ecclesiastical Architects and Surveyors Association, might usefully be appended. The first report should be the foundation document for subsequent reports, and works of repair carried out since the last inspection should be noted. If a series of reports are carried out by the same architect, he will acquire an intimate knowledge and an understanding of the building, and like a good family doctor, he will get to know his patient's strengths and weaknesses. He will also get to know the people responsible. And it must be said that the architect, in my view, should always be responsible to the representatives of the congregation, the Kirk Session, Congregational Board, Vestry, or whatever it may be, even if his name has to be approved or selected from a list approved by the diocese, presbytery, or other superior court. There should always, every church should have a fabric committee and a fabric convener. The minister has too many other things to do. Every fabric convener should maintain a logbook in which all relevant names and addresses, telephone numbers and so on should be entered, and all maintenance tasks or repair jobs undertaken noted. The logbook fills in the detail between quinquennial inspections and may help the architect to understand things he sees. A good solid notebook or ledger should be adequate for the purpose. The printed book, published by the Church of Scotland and called the Property Register, is in my view quite unsuitable, and I have yet to see an example conscientiously completed and kept up. It will be argued, I know, that the cost of this architectural family doctor service cannot be afforded by many congregations. I can only respond by saying that 25 years' experience in England has shown that it is almost impossible not to save the cost of the report, say £200 at present rates every 5 years, by the more efficient approach to maintenance which good reports make possible. In all honesty, it's the negligence of present procedures, or the lack of them, which is extravagant and which can no longer be afforded. There has been talk, I know, of Historic Buildings Council support towards the cost of the first architect's inspections on listed churches. Any such support is perhaps unlikely in the present financial climate. But in any case, I regret to say, for the intentions behind this proposal have been good, that I think the HBC should keep its money for repairs. The case for a proper system of inspections is so clear and so strong, and just as much in the interest of the churches as that of conservationists, that the offering of such carrots would be a waste of scarce and valuable carrots. Let the HBC use a bit of stick instead, and follow the example of the English HBC, and insist on the last architect's quinquennial inspection report being submitted with each and every grant application. The present shortage of funds provides the ideal opportunity for the adoption of a tougher line in this matter. May I also ask the HBC and the ancient monuments architects who advise the Council to change their approach in one other respect. The sort of conservative approach and long-term thinking which I am advocating means tackling repair work according to a system of priorities, not trying to do it all at once, and indeed not doing anything before it is really necessary. It's usually a mistake for all concerned to try to do too much at once in the belief that the work will be finished once and for all. The maintenance and repair of a building, like women's work in the old saying, for which I apologize, is never done. And it's fundamentally wrong and psychologically disastrous to think that it can be. It's therefore maddening to be told, when one has applied for a modest grant towards the cost of an urgent task, that the grant will be more than one has asked for, but that it will be conditional on all sorts of other things being done as well, 10 or 20 years sooner than they really need to be done. I've no argument in principle about standards of materials and workmanship. Proper repairs are the only repairs worth doing. But the need to concentrate on priorities is another matter. One consequence of this, of course, is that too much of the available grant money is being spent too rapidly on too few churches. Too many of my churches, and I hope none of them are listening, have been given money without which, with a bit of struggle perhaps, they would have managed. Too many others, whose merit was not or should not have been in doubt, have been denied the recognition, the psychological boost, the incentive which a small grant would have provided. It's in precisely this area, incidentally, that the Scottish Churches Trust has, with small resources, begun to play an important role. But is it too much to ask the Historic Buildings Council and its advisors to think again about some of these matters? We must progress beyond the grand restoration and the glossy before and after picture mentality of the 60s and 70s. If our kirks are to survive, we must mend the leaks and stop the rot on a broad front. Finally, a word about education and information. Fabric matters are not well understood by the clergy. May I humbly suggest that training for the ministry and priesthood should include a short course of lectures on fabric matters. May I also suggest that the odd course or conference in various parts of the country for fabric conveners and other interested laymen and clergy would not go amiss. Short courses for architects on the inspection and care of churches have already been proposed, and I hope that the first of these will be arranged by the Conservation Department of the Heriot Watt Edinburgh College of Art School of Architecture, with active support from the Ecclesiastical Architects and Surveyors Association before too long. In the meantime, there is a fair amount of published material, most of which produced by the Council for Care of Churches or by the Ecclesiastical Architects and Surveyors Association, which should be of interest to church representatives and to church architects. A list of these publications is, or shortly will be, available from Nick Allen of the Conservation Bureau, Scottish Development Agency, Telford Road, Edinburgh. Nick Allen is also able to advise on the availability of materials and expertise for all types of conservation, repair and restoration work, from slates and lead to glass and wall paintings, clocks and bells, textiles and plate. To sum up the second part of this paper, therefore, I believe that we could and should be striving to keep as many churches as possible available for worship. Our churches are in poor condition, and they've been deteriorating at least since the war. Churches operate on a long time scale, and with notable exceptions, the problems are chronic rather than acute. But they will take time to solve. We can and must learn from 25 years' experience in England of maintenance and repair procedures based on logbooks and architects' quinquennial inspections and reports. The Historic Buildings Council should tune its policies to this conservative and gradualist approach. Some education and training in church matters is necessary, and those wishing to avail themselves of current published information should apply to the Conservation Bureau. All this, as you will gather, is a personal view of what, according to the programme, though not according to me, is the present crisis. You may well reject some or all of my opinions, but whether you do or not, they are, I assure you, sincerely held and expressed in the hope that they may stimulate thought and discussion. I hope I may be forgiven in some quarters, notably at 25 Drumshoe Gardens, but if all my churches have their HBC grants withdrawn on Monday, you will understand why.